8th of May, 1945, joy spreads like wildfire through the streets of New York, London, Moscow and Paris as the victorious Allies celebrate the end of the Second World War. And yet, at the same time, a deathly silence reigns over the heart of Europe. A Europe that had been transformed into a gigantic field of ruins, in which roam hundreds of thousands of lost children who have survived the chaos almost miraculously. But these children's trials and tribulations are far from over. Their nightmare will continue for many years.
For us, the war didn't end it. We know that we have to get something.
We all had to grow up very fast because this is what it was. There was survival.
These lost children will become the first victims of the aftermath of war. Some will be forced to flee Europe to survive, while thousands of others will find themselves once again displaced, torn from their adoptive families, or stolen by countries desperate to replenish their populations. Many of them will not discover their true identity until many years later.
I told myself that when I retired, I would finally take the time to dig into my past. I visited 15 different archive centers. I wanted to know.
When I learned about this story, it came as a great shock.
It's vital to know your true story, not the one you've been burdened with. Where do we really come from?
To better understand what really happened to these children, we have to retrace the steps of these post-war events, notably through the intimate journals of the women, doctors, and volunteers who were tasked with helping these refugees. These unpublished accounts reveal the magnitude of the trauma suffered by so many thousands of children. Thanks to the extraordinary accounts of these post-war castaways, the unbelievable, horrific stories of these lost children of the war, whose futures were turned upside down, can be revealed.
I would have loved so much to get some sort of apology for what we endured. Not just for me, but for all the others too.
In the spring of 1945, centuries of culture and civilization had just been reduced to rubble. Virtually nothing was left of the Third Reich's territories in Germany, Poland, and the Ukraine. In the midst of this indescribable chaos, huge numbers of children began to emerge from the ruins. For the first time in history, children had become targets of the war, and what they had lived through went beyond comprehension. Like 12-year-old Ronja Hoffman, alone and wandering the streets somewhere in Poland.
I had no food, I had nothing. So I went to town and I started knocking at the door. Could you give me a little food? I'm hungry. So somebody gave me a piece of bread and somebody didn't give me anything. They closed the door in my face.
Like so many other Jewish children, Ronja Hoffman fell victim to the Nazis' barbarity. This young Polish girl spent the war fleeing the Einsatzgruppen squadrons of Nazi soldiers, whose job it was to systematically shoot to death Jews throughout Eastern Europe. What became known as the Holocaust by bullets did not spare Ronja's parents.
Once I was separated from my family, I had to sit 9 months at the attic and not to talk to anybody, just to go through Hitler.
Thousands of Jewish children were hunted down as part of the criminal folly of a regime that had decided to exterminate all the Jews in Europe. George Reinitz was 12 when his life was brutally torn apart. He and his family were arrested in Hungary because they were Jewish and were deported by the Germans to the Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp in the spring of 1944.
I remember perfectly, perfectly. We were told, get out of the car, woman over there and man over there.
We know exactly what went on to happen to George, his parents, and his 9-year-old sister, thanks to a series of photographs taken by a German officer during the deportation of Jews from Hungary. There was a process of selection, which meant that only those over the age of 17 were to survive. A process that George miraculously survived, thanks to a Polish prisoner who was with him on the train platform on arrival.
He says, how old is he? Pointing at me. So he says, you should say he's 17. I was 12, but I was a big kid. My mother asked him, what about my daughter? That was my sister, 9 years old. He just wouldn't answer, walk away. He was not supposed to talk to us altogether.
This advice to lie about his age saved George's life, but not those of his mother and sister, who, like all women with children, were immediately sent to the gas chambers and exterminated. George and his father now had to survive for 9 months in the section of Auschwitz reserved for those assigned to hard labor, a great number of whom died of exhaustion or hunger.
People are hungry for 1 day, 2 days, 3 days. They don't realize what it is to be hungry for months. And I used to close my eye and I say, if somebody would offer me, I can eat as much as I want. And he said, in order to exchange, I want to cut off your fingers. I would do it.
George was one of the few who was saved when they were discovered by the horrified Russian soldiers who liberated the camp of Auschwitz-Birkenau in January 1945. It was a day that George would never forget.
We saw a Russian coming from the east. Within 10 minutes, must have been 1,000 Russian soldiers inside. And we were kissing them and hugging them and thanking them. And
during these crucial weeks in the spring of 1945, Allied soldiers from the Soviet Union, the USA, Great Britain, and France got the upper hand over the German forces. As they conquered the Reich, they encountered one shocking surprise after another. For while some children were hunted down to be eliminated because they were Jewish, others, all over Eastern Europe, were torn from their families by the Nazis to be enlisted. This is what astonished American soldiers discovered when they came across a regiment of child soldiers in a barracks in Bavaria.
In Ungarn.
He's a Hungarian.
A Hungarian.
Seit wie lange sind Sie schon in der Schule?
4 Jahre.
Wie alt sind Sie?
12.
Wie lange sind Sie schon in der Schule?
In Schule?
Ja. Hanje Evra.
Hanje Evra 9. 9.
12 years of age, and he's had 3 years military training.
Janusz Bugaricki, a 10-year-old Pole, was one of hundreds of thousands of children who were kidnapped before being violently thrust into the heart of the chaos.
The war ruined our childhood. It stole our happiness from us. I was 10 years old when the Gestapo came for me. My mother said she wanted to come with me, but they said no and left her there. As for me, they took me to Górniak. There was a castle there, in which dozens of doctors examined me from head to toe.
Janusz was sent from his native town of Łódź in Poland to Oberweiss in Austria, 800 kilometers away. His fate was the same as that of many of his fellow unfortunates who were forced to become child soldiers or forced into hard labor to serve the Nazi war machine.
They gave me a number. After that, I was no longer allowed to use my first name, just my number. Every word we said in Polish got us 3 days without food, 3 days without sleep, or 3 days of marching. Bloody Polish pigs, dirty little mongrels. They were always looking for an excuse to beat us. Every day they beat us, and there was nothing to eat. When I think back to it all today, I feel what I felt then, as if it was yesterday.
Along with Janusz, lost in Austria, Ronya in the wilds of Poland and the Ukraine, or George, freed from Auschwitz, far from his Hungarian home. There were thousands upon thousands of children who swelled the vast flood of refugees that roamed Europe when the war ended. A real tragedy was unfolding as they tried to make their way back home. How were they to travel, to keep warm, and especially eat, when they had lost everything? Hunger became the daily plight for millions of European survivors. There was a need for urgent action. And the Allied powers did just that, launching the greatest humanitarian operation in history. The UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, which united 47 countries, was henceforth responsible for protecting, feeding, and most of all, repatriating millions of displaced people. 12,000 doctors, nurses, and social workers were urgently sent to over 700 camps across Central Europe. It was a harrowing humanitarian mission for which nothing had prepared them. This is the account of an American UNRWA volunteer responsible for all the lost children within a vast area of Austria. Alita Brownlee tells the story of a rescue operation that turned out to be far more complicated than expected.
Nobody was prepared for the reality we're up against. There are very young children as well as adolescents. Most of them wear filthy clothes and drag their feet in old shoes full of holes. What is so demoralizing is that every day the army brings us more of them. It is such a daunting task.
This is what happened to Janusz, the former child soldier, lost close to Salzburg in Austria, where he and a small group of other Polish children faced an everyday struggle to survive. This is when he would meet American soldiers.
We went off to steal food from the Americans because we were hungry. There were 4 of us. We went over to an American soldier who was standing there. But he spoke to us in Polish. That really shocked us. We hugged him as hard as we could. He said, "What do you want?" We all answered, "Bread."
The American soldiers took the group of Polish children to the nearest UNRWA camp in Salzburg.
The first time they made us breakfast, we stuffed everything into our pockets. Once we got outside, it was all gone within minutes. Then the camp leader told us, "Look, you don't need to steal bread. You'll get as much food as you need." And that's when a new life started for us.
The humanitarian workers now had to begin the incredibly arduous process of research and identification to try to find the homes of these thousands of children who could often only provide snippets of information about their past.
Sometimes finding solutions was like looking for a miracle. Like this little girl we found in an abandoned house. Do you know this place? London? She couldn't have been more than 4. Vienna?
Vienna?
She had absolutely no documentation on her. Look, do you know Paris? Berlin?
Du bist Deutsch?
Thanks to the UNRWA's work, thousands of children were able to return to their families.
I swear it's impossible to describe. It's quite incredible. Not only did my friends and I survive the war, but Heniek, Jurek, me and all the others finally made it back home.
The young Pole, Janusz Bugaricki, was one of the lucky ones whose family were found by the UNRWA. But the hardest was yet to come for the humanitarian organization. There were still thousands of children who could not be identified. So, brochures were published. Calls for witnesses appeared in newspapers. German cinemas even screened footage with the faces of lost children when there was no other way of tracking their families down.
Auch dieses Kind hat keinen Namen und wurde ebenfalls in Pankow gefunden. Ein 18 Monate altes Mädchen, gefunden auf einem Feld in Wandlitzsee.
But as they tried to piece together these chaotic journeys, the social workers began to ask themselves a question that would prove to be crucial. Why were there so many of these children in Germany and Austria? Certainly there were orphans. There were those who had fled bombs and persecution, and yet others who had been forced to become child soldiers. But this still did not explain why there were so many of them. The first conundrum facing the UNRWA's social assistance was that of babies, less than 2 years old, who had been abandoned in strange nurseries all over Germany, and whose identity papers revealed that some of them were not even born in Germany. What they discovered when they tried to understand how these infants had ended up there was horrifying.
So in this photograph, that's me sitting at the feet of the supervisor. I look sad. It's not that I have a faraway look. I look sad, as if I'm wondering where I am.
Gisela Magula was 2 years old when the UNRWA found her in a Munich orphanage in 1945. The only document they found revealed that the little girl had been born in 1943 in Vegimont in Belgium, in a very special kind of nursery. It was a Lebensborn, one of the maternity hospitals the Nazis had set up all over Europe that were designed to raise the future racially pure elite of the Third Reich. Female Nazi sympathizers were impregnated by SS soldiers who were seen as the masculine ideal of virility and strength. When they were born, babies like Gisela were raised in these Lebensborns and became the exclusive property of the German state.
When I found out, I thought I was going to die. It goes against everything I believe in. I couldn't believe it. I was born into this. That was really difficult to accept.
Towards the end of the war, defeated German troops hurriedly repatriated the children of the Lebensborns to the heart of the Reich, like Gisela, who was taken from Belgium and ended up close to Munich. When the UNRWA found her in Germany, Gisela had no parents and no nationality. The decision was taken to return her to her birthplace, Vegimont. But then the humanitarian organization made a mistake that would shake the course of her destiny.
I found my UNRWA registration records. So, Magula Gisela, born 11th of October 1943 in Vegimont, France. But in fact, there is no Vegimont in France. A mistake was made, and I don't know why, but they marked me down as being French.
The French authorities did not notice the error, but repopulation was paramount and the infant was welcomed. So the young Gisela found herself on a train with dozens of other war orphans. They left Germany and headed for France.
An appeal was launched to towns across France, including Commercy in the Meuse region, which was one of the first to welcome war children. My mum told me, when I went to get you from Commercy Hospital, people were already choosing their children. And you held your arms out to me, and we reached out to each other.
France had given the little girl a family and had no hesitation in erasing all traces of her German past.
Gisela Magula, born in Bar-le-Duc. This judgment constitutes the birth certificate of the aforenamed.
Gisela Magula had become Gisèle Petit, officially born in Bar-le-Duc. This abrupt change of identity was supposed to protect the children and their new parents, but would in fact haunt Giselle her whole life.
So actually, when my mother died, I was 61, and I started researching my identity, because for me it's vital to know your true story, not the one you've been burdened with. After all, we all need to understand where we come from. Your father, your mother, your siblings. You can't live without that.
After many trips to Germany and Belgium and endless letters, Giselle finally tracked down her late mother and found a few mysterious photographs among her belongings.
During my research, I found a photograph of a German soldier. There's nothing on the back, except you can see the name has been torn off. So, is this the father? My father? Or not?
Gisèle Petit had the courage to confront the story of little Gisela Magula. But her whole life, she harbored doubts about the identity of her German father, who made her a child victim of Nazi madness. One among so many others. These Lebensborns, the workings of which the UNRWA now understood in detail, were in fact a mere cog in a far bigger machine. To their horror, investigators discovered in Nazi registers that many, many children, this time stolen from the East, were most certainly hidden throughout the country. It therefore became urgent for the UNRWA to find these vanished children that Germany was trying to hide. This was the mission of Susan Pettis, a 25-year-old American social worker stationed in the south of the country.
Despite the bad will of the local authorities, I found one group of Hungarian children in a home, and yet more children in orphanages, hospitals, and even convents. In Kaufbeuren, Bavaria, the woman in charge told me the place was empty, when in fact she had hidden a group of Polish children away before we arrived. There seems to be an infinite number of situations like these.
In just 3 months, the UNRWA would inventory thousands of children from East European countries. But why had the Nazis brought so many of them to Germany? Susan and her team delved into the archives, and what they brought to light was particularly chilling. In a bid to reinforce the Reich and weaken the people of East European countries, notably the Poles, the Nazis developed a large-scale operation called the Germanization of children. To achieve this, they organized the generalized kidnapping of young children under the age of 6, whom they considered racially pure. These children were forcibly taken from their parents or kidnapped from parks or as they left school. Most of them were handed over to German or Austrian families to be educated according to the morals of the Reich.
I'm now responsible for many Polish children. With their new foster families, they have been able to completely forget where they came from, and most of them seem very happy.
Anna Berezovska was most probably taken from Poland when she was born and handed over to a family in Austria where she grew up feeling loved.
I lived in a little wooden house high up in the mountains, hidden in the forest. There was a boy, only a little older than me, who helped look after me. I thought he was my brother. My happiest moments were when I came home and Mom would be waiting for me with open arms. Mama Rosa took great care of me. She would cuddle me, tell me stories, and sing me lullabies. That's the kind of happy childhood I enjoyed.
Anna was one of the thousands of children found by the UNRWA, so many more than the social workers could ever have imagined. The countries affected by these kidnappings estimated that some 300,000 children had disappeared in this way. But what was to be done? Seize these children from their new homes and send them back to their countries of birth? Or allow them to stay with their German adoptive families? International negotiations ensued, and a decision was taken. The UNRWA was ordered to take the children away from the families they were living with and return them to the countries where they were born. This was a difficult mission for the UNRWA's social workers, who were torn between many conflicting feelings.
We worked on the principle that there was no other choice but to take these children back home. But in fact, with each child we tore from its family, we became more and more troubled by what we were doing.
I was dragged from my bed in the middle of the night. There were 2 men in green uniforms. I was still half asleep. I didn't understand the commotion all around me. And I remember my mom dressed me in really warm clothes. The only thing that mattered to her was that I wasn't sad. So she gave me my teddy bear and then turned back around and gave me my doll. It must have been horrible for her. She stood in the doorway, watching me leave, wringing her hands, tears streaming down her face.
For Anna, this meant being sent by train to Poland, the country that she had now been told was hers. But while on the platforms of Warsaw Station people celebrated the return of these young survivors, there was no one waiting for this little girl, whose biological parents the UNRWA had been unable to find.
I woke up in an orphanage. There were lots of children all around me. The beds were too small for us, and our feet hung off the end. And adults used to beat us when we wet the bed. I remember that every night I tried to run away because I knew that I had to go home to my mom, who was waiting for me and must be frantic with worry because I hadn't come home. Once I smashed the windows of a glass door. Another time I hid in a haystack. I made it to a sawmill once and even to a train station. I'd bite, hit, and spit. I did everything I could to try and get back to Mama Rosa.
Anna was never again to see her Austrian mother. Like thousands of children sent back to their countries of origin, she had to create her own future in a country that was completely foreign to her, with which, ultimately, she felt no real bond. The more time went by, the more complex to unravel the situations facing the UNRWA's social workers became. How could they face up to the agony of these children, broken by war, and for whom there were ever fewer solutions? The task was particularly difficult when it involved Jewish children who had been rescued from the Nazis' program of extermination, children who had most often lost their parents or even their whole family. The UNRWA's humanitarians were at a loss, having to deal with children who no longer behaved like children, who hardly spoke, expressed no emotion, and would often become violent when any adult tried to approach them. An old convent in the German town of Indersdorf was transformed into a center for these severely traumatized children. Their care was specifically based on speech, a sense of independence, and creating a group spirit. This veritable refuge was run by a Czech social assistant named Greta Fischer.
Many children develop deep feelings of guilt about still being alive while their families have been exterminated. But their strength and their will to live are extraordinary. I try to offer them a reassuring and stimulating environment, to create a relationship based on trust that can turn into affection. We are everything to these children: a nurse, a mother.
A truck came and picked us up and took us to Indersdorf. It was paradise when we were finished with everything. We got right away food, and we got a place to stay and a place to get washed. We were very happy, we were very thrilled.
Ronya, the orphan who miraculously escaped the Holocaust by bullets in Poland, was struggling to survive when a Jewish association dedicated to helping the persecuted smuggled her into Germany to the Indersdorf camp. Her and her story that is so heavy to bear.
Everybody had their stories. We never talked about anything that was happening to us, how we got there, what their lives were before. Nobody spoke about anything. That was part of our existence.
The objective at Indersdorf was to bring fresh hope to these children who would have to try to find a place in the world that had treated them so harshly.
In Indersdorf, it was a feeling that we were all together and we had all of our people the same age, more or less. For the first time, actually, I start feeling like I'm a teenager.
In Ronya's case, the future she made for herself was in the United States, where she managed to find a lost uncle of hers who was prepared to take her in.
I had nobody. I was a free agent. I could go any place I wanted to go. So I said, what have I got to lose? Let me go see America.
Ronya took a ship to New York and never looked back. She became Bonnie, an American citizen married to a fellow survivor whom she had met in Germany. For over a year, UNRWA's volunteers had worked tirelessly to achieve success in a mission of epic proportions. Many goals had already been reached. Stolen children had been returned to their home countries. Others, previously lost, had been returned to their families. But from the start of 1947, their mission became increasingly hard to fulfill when international cooperation substantially diminished. Whilst in the aftermath of the war, the victorious nations had celebrated their alliance in the face of all the challenges, they now began to find themselves at loggerheads. The first theatre of this confrontation was Germany, which at the end of the war had been divided up into 4 zones controlled by the former Allied powers: American, British, French, and Russian. And in these zones, children once again saw their futures shaken at the whim of countries whose only priority now was to strengthen themselves. The Soviets were the first to put an end to the UNRWA's activities in their zone. It was unthinkable that they should tolerate a humanitarian organization whose actions they saw, more than anything, as American interference. The Soviets believed that they were the ones who should shoulder the responsibility for the isolated children in their zone. This new USSR policy worried its former allies, as demonstrated by these alarmist messages sent by the authorities of the French zone.
The Russians are transporting the children of unknown parents to their country in their thousands and making them Soviet citizens.
The Soviet leader, Joseph Stalin, needed to reinforce his country, which had paid a terrible price in the war with over 20 million dead. And to achieve this, Stalin had a vision, that of a new man, one who would resurrect the USSR. A project of which the cornerstone was youth. Therefore, it was imperative to get as many children as possible to conform to this new communist ideal throughout the USSR's territories from Moscow to Berlin. So in the zone they occupied in eastern Germany during the many years that their influence in that part of the country lasted, the Soviets demanded that the Germans recite their faith in the Russian Revolution.
So hat die Sowjetunion immer wieder durch die Tat bewiesen, dass sie ein wahrer Freund des deutschen Volkes ist. Sie will sich und uns den Frieden bewahren. Und aus diesem Grunde empfinde ich tiefe Freundschaft zu dem sowjetischen Volk.
The same methods were employed in the other countries, in what was becoming the Soviet bloc. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Hungary. This is what George came to discover. George, the boy who had escaped from Auschwitz and made it back to his village in Hungary.
In my mind, I never believed that my mother and father are not going to be there. Because we made up that anything happens, we're going to be meeting in my village.
George waited for his parents and watched as his country was transformed from the moment the Soviets began to impose their vision of the world.
The communist regime trying to brainwash the people that comrade Stalin is our savior, our God, and he had to go and march. May the 1st, I was the tallest kid there. I was carrying the flag, but I wouldn't want to stay there. I just wanted to get out of there.
George was now nearly 16 and had just learned the terrible news he feared most, that his parents and his sister had not survived. He now had just one thought: to get out of Hungary. That's when a Jewish association told him that Canada was accepting orphans saved from the Holocaust.
Canada brought in some orphans under 18 years old, so I fell into that category. It didn't register till I went on a boat, went on a ship, and I said, hey, where am I going? I don't know anybody. I said, I went through Auschwitz. Whatever comes my way, I'm going to survive. And when I got off the ship, I had one box which I threw overboard, as you know. I came in with my hand in my pocket. And they said, what would you like to do? I said, I want to have a job where there is food. So they put me in a night shift in a bakery. Immediately. And I was eating bread and cakes all night. It was paradise.
George Reinitz, a miraculously saved Hungarian Jew, became a Canadian citizen, definitively turning his back on a Europe that had almost eaten him alive. Europe was now splitting into two blocks, separated by what Winston Churchill called the Iron Curtain. Since 1947, these two blocks had become engaged in what soon became known as the Cold War. A new power balance had taken root and divided Germany in two. Once again, it was the children who found themselves at the heart of the negotiations, particularly concerning the painful dossiers of those seized by the Nazis in Eastern Europe and who were still in Germany, notably in the British zone. Initially, there was an international consensus that they should be returned to their countries of origin. The British soon refused to send children to the East. This change of policy would condemn a number of these children to a very long wait before they could hope to discover their true identity.
My
name is Hermann Ludeking, but my real name is in fact Roman Rasatowski. This photo was taken at the Lutz orphanage in Poland. And these are all children who were stolen and later taken to Germany. That's me. There.
For a long time, Hermann had believed that he was German. It was only many years later, on the day he buried his father, that he discovered his true identity.
I have always been inquisitive. I searched around in my adoptive father's wardrobe, and at the back I found all these documents. I only flicked through them, but that was enough to tell me that my parents were not my real parents. Later, I made inquiries to try to understand what had really happened. It was a quest to unravel my past. When I went to Poland, I visited at least 15 archive centers. I needed to find answers.
Despite all his efforts, Hermann never succeeded in finding his birth family. But during his inquiries, he was able to reconstitute the chain of events when he was still with his parents in Lemgo in the British zone. Everything started from the moment he was found by the Polish Red Cross.
There is no doubt that Roman Rosatowski is a Polish child stolen by the SS. We request that without delay, the child be taken from the home of Mrs. Ludeking so that he can be prepared for repatriation.
The British authorities were duty-bound to launch an inquest into Hermann's foster family, Germans who turned out to be former Nazi personnel.
My adoptive mother was the director of a BDM, a Center for the League of German Girls. My mother was very enthusiastic about Adolf Hitler. To be honest, she remained a firm Nazi until the bitter end.
What was to be done with young Hermann? The British sent social worker Nellie Brand to meet with him at home. But in fact, the decision had already been taken. The new British policy was clear, as Colonel Gray explained.
Every child we send back to the East will, in the future, be against us.
Hermann remembers this strange visit very clearly.
Hermann?
What happened was that Miss Nellie Brand came to see me with an interpreter who tried to speak to me in Polish.
Und die hat versucht, mit mir Polnisch zu sprechen.
Good morning, Herman. Dzień dobry.
But I didn't understand a word. I've never spoken Polish. I just remember the interpreter saying, well, this child can't be Polish. He doesn't understand a word I'm saying.
Despite his foster family's Nazi past, the child would not return to Poland.
My dear Mrs. Ludeking, I am very pleased to inform you that the military government ruled that Herman should remain with you.
I'd like to have known who my parents were, what they looked like, whether I had brothers and sisters. But I'll probably never be able to uncover any information. It's all over. Case closed. All I can do is go over and over it in my head.
Herman, a victim of the Germanization of children, felt as though his identity had been stolen when he was left with his German family. Conversely, Anna, the girl who had been torn from her Austrian adoptive family and sent back to Poland, suffered for years from not being accepted in her new country.
How many times did I hear, look, there's that Kraut bitch. We should send her back where she came from. Then we wouldn't have to feed her. At school, I would answer questions in German. Each time, the teacher would tell me to hold my hands out like this and hit me across my knuckles with a ruler. They hit me so often that they knocked the German out of me, and I never, ever spoke it again.
Two destinies, two opposing decisions, but the same pain. That of the victims of the Germanization of children, so sought after by the Nazis, a crime that ultimately could never be atoned for. In this Germany, divided up into different sectors, children became a precious asset that countries secretly fought over. And one country in particular kept a close eye on these lost children. After the war, France desperately needed to repopulate. 1.5 million children were not brought into the world because of the conflict. Faced with this painful truth, very quickly, General de Gaulle himself gave a very clear order.
I ask that you look into the arrival in France of children of all nationalities, orphans or alone, currently to be found in Germany.
Subsequently, in the German zone occupied by the French, the military followed this order to the letter. It continued to be followed by successive governments. Little concern was shown over the methods employed to achieve this goal, as demonstrated by unpublished archives from the French command.
Our services strive to remove from UNRWA control all perfectly healthy and well-developed children who have no prospect of ever being claimed.
When it came to getting hold of these isolated children, everything was permitted. Like in 1947, when the French discovered that Denmark was sheltering thousands of German refugees.
Subject, children of Denmark. The Ministry of Population's attention has been drawn to the presence in Denmark of 2,000 to 3,000 German children whose parents are unknown.
France went on to suggest to Denmark that these refugees be repatriated to the zone it occupied in Germany, with the promise of placing them in the care of the UNRWA. Their intentions seemed laudable, but in fact, the French authorities had an ulterior motive.
The true and secret aim of the French authorities is to absorb a significant proportion of this mass of children. In order not to offend Danish sensibilities, it is advisable not to reveal this goal.
To achieve this, the French military elaborated a plan that showed their lack of scruples. They gathered the children they had selected on a train in 4 separate carriages. the train left Denmark, headed for Germany and Offenburg in the French-occupied zone. But during the journey, the carriages containing the children mysteriously vanished. The French believed that their discreet kidnapping operation had gone unnoticed. But when the train arrived, the Red Cross, who were responsible for the refugees, noticed that children were missing. They investigated, and when 3 weeks later they realized what had really happened, they immediately sent a very firm complaint to the French military command.
General, 217 children who were in the Danish convoy never reached Offenburg. This convoy of children, made up of 4 railway carriages, were, on the orders of the French authorities, detached at Koblenz station.
The plan hatched by the French was to divert the 4 carriages of children at Koblenz, to take them somewhere else in the French zone, to Traben-Trabach in the Black Forest, where the children were housed in a center under the control of the French forces. The Red Cross discovered that French families were being sent to the center to adopt the children. For the organization, this was nothing less than proof of kidnapping, and therefore a crime against the children and their families. The affair looked like it was going to turn into an international scandal, until the French made a U-turn, and the 217 children were eventually discreetly returned to the German authorities. The French military command disingenuously covered up the affair and denied the Red Cross's accusation.
The rumor that a decision was taken to send these children to French families who would then adopt them is nothing more than fantasy.
The French authorities understood that they had to change tack. They would henceforth prioritize a reclamation of children nobody could challenge them over. Within months, the solution was in place, and thousands of babies who were being born from relations between French soldiers and young German women were being taken to France. In the French zone, just as in all the occupied zones, Soviet, American and British, there were hundreds of thousands of young soldiers in the prime of their lives, drunk on victory, who often believed that German women, in the face of defeat, were part of the spoils of war. Many German women were raped, while others had to resort to prostitution to survive. But some of them were also simply seduced by these young men, far from home, such as on the banks of Lake Tegel in Berlin, or in the jazz clubs of the Reich's former capital. These encounters often turned into genuine love stories. And all these relationships, be they fleeting or sincere, led to the birth of a huge number of children. So it was in the French-occupied zone, where 20,000 babies were born to German mothers and French soldiers. This was an unbelievable boon for the French authorities, who would do everything possible to get hold of these newborns.
National interest requires that this retrieval of children of French blood should be carried out with the highest possible success rate.
General Koenig, commander-in-chief of the French zone, launched a great repatriation operation. First, he ordered the German authorities to immediately declare any birth of an infant fathered by a Frenchman. For Koenig, there was no doubt that these children belonged to France.
I knew I'd been adopted, that had never been kept from me, and that I was born in Germany, in Val-d'Orme. But no more than that. I knew nothing more. It wasn't until 2018 that we decided to go and see the village where I was born. And it was in Val-d'Orme that I found out. There was an address on my birth certificate. I wanted to see the house where I was born. When I arrived, I met an old man. I only found out later that he was my uncle. And when he saw me, he said several times, "I've been waiting to see you for 70 years." That meant since the days when he used to bounce me on his knee, when I was 3 or 4 months old. That's when we found out there was a big file on me.
Sebastian Driesbach found out that he is really Hans-Peter Springmann, born to a German mother and a French soldier.
The child was baptized here. I was the godfather. We love that boy. Even today, it still makes me sad.
I discovered a family. I could barely speak because I was paralyzed by the emotion and by apprehension. I have to say, it was a huge shock.
Un gros choc.
I was also pretty scandalized by what I found out about the French policy in Germany at the time. It somewhat diminished my admiration for General Koenig.
The reclamation procedure was perfectly honed. As soon as a child of a French father was born, an officer went to the mother's home with the objective of making her sign an official act of abandonment of her baby.
I hereby declare that I renounce all my rights to this child and entrust him to the French state.
These young single mothers were easy prey. With rationing still in force in Germany, feeding a newborn was not easy. All too often, these women, who were frowned upon by society, gave in to the pressure from the French authorities.
As I already have a 2.5-year-old daughter to raise, I'm not able to feed my son, Robert. I hereby declare that I renounce all my rights forever.
Thousands of letters of abandonment can be found in the French National Archives. Sebastian wanted to know the truth at all costs and managed to find the statement of abandonment signed by his German mother. This document changed the young boy's life.
I, the undersigned, Springmann Erne, declare on my honor that I have a child from a French father and desire for personal reasons to relinquish him to the care of the French authorities. Everything's typewritten, except my mother Erne Springmann's signature. I have no reason to doubt that she was forced into giving me up. The story my family tells is that she was threatened with prison if she didn't submit.
We Germans were the losers, and we had to obey. We received an official letter saying we had to return the child by such and such a date, full stop. We weren't allowed to keep him. We didn't know if we'd ever see him again. We at least wanted a photo of the lad. I took it.
The baby, who was then called Hans-Peter, was sent to a nursery requisitioned by the French army. The administration of this key site in the apparatus for reclaiming children was entrusted to Dr. Marie Helmer, an overzealous civil servant.
I have been tasked by the ministry to organize the running of this nursery. It is an extremely difficult job, but so thrilling. The abandoned children that come to us are in rather poor states of health. I actually call them my little walking dead.
In fact, Dr. Helmer's brief was to select the babies. France dreamt of a healthy and robust, genetically perfect population. In an effort to achieve this, they did not hesitate to pick and choose among these newborns.
Only those who will be capable of fulfilling their role as French citizens can be sent to France, and I reject all those I think should be rejected. Simone? I was able to return all those whom I considered backward. They were returned to the Germans under various pretexts. Among them, a doubt concerning their French origins.
When young Hans-Peter Springmann was picked up by Dr. Helmer, she wrote a very precise note on his state of health.
Very fat child. In good condition, though a little listless. Because of his weight being far greater than is normal for his age, he has been put on a strictly monitored diet.
Previously, the boy was eating at all hours and whatever he wanted. In the 2 months between my arrival and departure, I lost 600 grams. So, the diet worked.
After 2 months at the nursery, our little walking dead have almost all become fine children. I now have a rather large convoy to send to France, and I hope they will all become good French citizens.
Dr. Helmer declared young Hans-Peter apt. He was transferred to France along with other chosen children. Before he arrived, the French authorities changed his identity. Hans-Peter became Sébastien, for a new family in Paris who were already expecting him.
I was exceptionally lucky because I had a very loving adoptive family. It's just that now I think I'm living a life which could very easily not have been mine.
After that, we never heard anything about him again. We didn't know what name he'd been given or where he was. I went to the French consulate in Offenburg, I wrote letters, nothing.
For over 70 years, Sebastian's German family had no news of him. Hundreds like him were torn from their German families and transplanted to France, all for the greater interest of the nation. In the West, as in the East, these children were the incarnation of the hope for a new world, a world that could only be better. These children became symbols of a new peaceful and harmonious society. But in reality, the demon of racism still plagued countries that didn't hesitate to reject all those who, in their eyes, did not have the right origins. Many were those who couldn't find their place anywhere on the continent. This was the case of the Jewish children rescued from the Holocaust, who once again found themselves having to flee to survive. In Eastern Europe, in Poland, as in Czechoslovakia, anti-Semitic hatred did not disappear with the Nazis.
In Poland, the atmosphere was very bad for us. The Polacks hate us, and they say it, and they call us Żyd. For us, the war didn't end it.
Eliyahu Yakir was 10 years old. He had spent the war hiding in a Russian orphanage. He had lost everything, his family and his home, when he ended up in the town of Łódź in Poland, where he was guided to a home run by a 24-year-old Jewish woman, Hasha Bialichka.
The door opened, and I saw a beautiful woman. She was, you know, like a fairy tale for me. On the table was a big basket full of bread. I think it was the first time since I remember myself that I saw so many bread, just standing. Nobody is taking it.
This secret Jewish organization, Bricha, entrusted Hasha Balitschke with the mission of rescuing all the imperiled Jewish children wandering through the streets of Łódź. Children like 12-year-old Irka, who had only survived by hiding in a forest for several months. Or Stasha, 8 years old, sold to a Ukrainian peasant who abused him and made him sleep with the animals. And Eliyahu Yakir, who during the war lost the ability to speak after a violent bombardment.
I came, I think it was number 27, 28. And with the time, the place grown more and more children, till we got to the number of 73 children.
In her private journal, Hasha recounts how despite having no experience, she suddenly had to take care of dozens of traumatized children and do what she could to give them a new lease of life.
I had no idea how to take care of these children who had survived such horrors. I felt that they needed a welcoming environment. It was the only way to earn their trust. I held them in my arms, cuddled them. I would get up at any time of night if they needed me. I did it so that each child could feel I belonged to them.
I got love, I got a hug, I got a kiss. It was the first time from the end of the war that I felt that I'm belonging to something that I want to be.
But the sanctuary offered by Hasha sadly proved too precarious. Because in the summer of 1946, Poland was ravaged by pogroms. Dozens of Jewish men, women and children were massacred. The Jewish organizations that tried to save these children understood that their safety could no longer be guaranteed.
Tonight, after dinner, I told the children we have to leave in the middle of the night. And I want each of you to say goodbye to Poland out loud. The children had lived in this house for 3 months and were really sad about leaving.
But how to escape this territory that had become so lethally dangerous? The Brycia organization came up with a plan that took advantage of the flood of thousands of German-speaking refugees at the time, also trying to flee Poland for Germany. The plan was for the Jewish children to pretend to be German refugees and blend in with the traveling masses. They were sent to the station in small groups so as not to attract attention. Once on the train, Hasha placed her charges in the care of childless couples so as to make them look like families. Almost as if by magic, the first hurdle had been overcome.
I looked out of the window and felt the cool air on my face. I said to myself, we really have left Poland and our lives are no longer in danger.
We get to the German border, then we left the train. We didn't have any personal belongings, almost nothing, only what we dressed.
Eliyahu and all of Hasha's children fleeing Poland were in fact only at the beginning of their odyssey. The secret destination that the Jewish organizations had chosen for them was Palestine in the Middle East, more than 4,000 kilometers away. Their first stop was Lübeck in Germany, in the British-occupied zone, because at the time it was the British who had a mandate over Palestine. Faced with this sudden influx, The overwhelmed British authorities refused to hand out passes to these refugees arriving in their zone in their thousands, and even went as far as forbidding their access to the camps. Hasha and her lost children were trapped, and they were soon joined by tens of thousands of other destitute Jews. These were particularly difficult times for the young woman who was beginning to doubt herself.
One of the girls was burning up with fever and in a lot of pain. I couldn't call a nurse or a doctor. I had no medicines. I was scared she was going to die. How could I have been so irresponsible, leaving alone with 70 children on that journey?
This extremely precarious situation required an urgent solution. Cue the intervention of Jewish associations, notably the biggest at the time, the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, or JDC. Their first decision was to repatriate the 250,000 refugees to the American zone and to negotiate with the military authorities and the UNRWA to get new camps set up destined specifically for the East European Jews. The aim was to leave Germany as quickly as possible, and more than ever, Palestine seemed like the only viable option for these survivors of Nazi barbarity, who once again feared for their lives. Everything was put in place to prepare these refugees for a life in a world they knew nothing about.
The Jewish agency, they started to teach us Hebrew. So I never went to a class because I couldn't be concentrated or to think even, to go, and I never knew how to read, how to write.
For months, the associations put pressure on the British authorities to provide the precious passes. But the British, who were dealing with confrontations between Palestine's Jewish and Arab communities, were unwilling to grant permission to everyone who requested it. There was only one solution: to go underground once again and try to reach Palestine clandestinely.
In the middle of the night, they wake up us, put us in trucks. The trucks were covered. They put empty barrels of gasoline, so we sat inside, not allowed to speak, not allowed to do anything, to be quiet, until we got, after a few hours of driving, to a place in France, Sat.
At the port of Set, Eliyahu boarded the Theodore Herzl, along with 3,600 other survivors, including over 500 children. Destination, Haifa. Their arduous journey started in August 1947, and it took more than a year for Eliyahu and his 72 companions to escape a Europe that had become too dangerous for them. They would all make a new life in what a few months later became the State of Israel. Hasha Belichka's mission had finally been accomplished.
I saw in Hassa my mother. What she did, nobody did. She was a hero.
The Europe that these thousands of persecuted Jews had left forever was now in the full swing of reconstruction. In Germany, what people dreamt was that their children could live in a country that would soon be able to determine its own destiny once again, with the hope, after years of chaos, to be able to erase the last stigma of war. But some scars would never disappear. In a German society still gripped by racism and a desire to finally turn the page on their defeat, it was now the turn of yet another category of children to be rejected. Over 5,000 mixed-race children were born from relations between German women and Afro-American soldiers. These children were rejected by the segregationist United States that strictly forbade sexual relations between black men and white women, a rule they also wanted to enforce in Europe.
Any marriage between a Negro and a white woman is deemed contrary to the interests of the army, as it could provoke social problems on the soldiers' return to America.
Whenever the American military command learned that a black soldier had fathered a child, in order to put a stop to the relationship, the soldier was immediately detached from his unit or sent straight back home. This is what happened to the father of a little girl born in 1947. Ika Hugel, whose existence the United States preferred to ignore, would grow up alone with her mother in Bavaria, in a German society that violently rejected her.
We, the children of Afro-American soldiers, obviously stood out. At the time, my mother and other mothers like her were called, and I don't like saying it, Negroes' whores.
Ika's fate would not get any better when the German Federal Republic was founded in 1949. This new democracy in the west of the country, and supported by Western powers, reserved a very special fate for these inconvenient children.
The Child Protection Services decided that it would be bad for my development to stay at home, and that what was best for me was to take me from my family. What they really wanted was to get rid of all the children with different colored skin. The presence of these mixed-race kids was just another reminder that Germany had lost the war.
The German government's objective was to isolate these children, to make them invisible. Ika was 6 years old when she was separated from her mother and taken 500 kilometers away to a home where she remained incarcerated for nearly 9 years.
It was a very traumatic experience that many others went through too. My mother had suddenly disappeared from my life. It was only when I got there that I became aware of being different to the other kids, and it caused me a lot of suffering. Like the time when someone scrubbed at my face with a hard brush to prove I wasn't made of chocolate.
In this home, normally reserved for mentally deficient children, Ika was subjected to particularly violent treatment.
Well, of course, that reinforced my feeling of inferiority. I was told I had the devil in me and that it had to be driven out. One day I was taken, I don't know where, and I was locked in a room where I was told to get down on my knees to drive the devil out of me. It all contributed to, how should I put it, destroying my spirit a little more.
Ika returned home when she was 15. The young woman then embarked on a long quest to discover her identity, to try to rebuild herself, having been rejected by both Germany and the United States. When she was 18, she found the strength to write to her missing father after a long and difficult search for his address.
Unfortunately, do not know whether you live or you are die. Do you know that you have a daughter with 18 years? I hope if you live, please write me a letter.
That was in 1965.
The address was wrong, and the letter returned to sender. It took many more years for the young woman to dare to cross the Atlantic and search for a father she still knew nothing about. In the mid-90s, her perseverance led her to a suburb of Chicago.
Yes, it took me a long time to find him, but I'm really very happy. When you've waited all your life to see your father, and you finally find yourself in front of him, at first you can't even think straight. We just looked at each other, observing each other. We weren't ready to talk about how we felt. What was remarkable was that I had inherited some of his mannerisms, his facial expressions, despite never living with him. That made it clear. There was no mistaking it. He really was my father.
After years of searching, Ika is still striving to overcome her childhood trauma. Today, she has been able to add her father's name, Marshall, to that of her mother, Hugel. She even has American citizenship. Ika's long and painful journey to reappropriate her past is the same as that endured by the other lost children of the war, whose stories we have just heard. Each of them has had to find their own way to survive and rebuild themselves. Like George Reinitz, the child rescued from Auschwitz, who ended up in Canada.
I was an angry kid. It was pursued. In those days, the Jews were always never fight. And I said, God, I'm not going to run away anymore. I'm going to stand my ground. And this is what created the wrestling.
10 years after arriving, the Hungarian orphan became wrestling champion of Canada, a country whose national symbol he has tattooed over his Auschwitz deportation number. Anna Berezowska, the child stolen by the Nazis, adopted in Austria, and then sent back to Poland, had no other option but to rebuild herself without ever knowing her real identity.
Sadly, I will never know who my real parents were. I never found out. All the information in my identity documents is made up. That's just something I have to live with.
Herman Ludeking became obsessed by the thought of uncovering the truth. But his investigation took its toll on his relationship with his German adoptive mother, who could not bear her son's quest.
My adoptive mother said that she didn't want me to go to her funeral. She was afraid that I'd create a scandal because of the documents I'd found. That was her wish, so I didn't go.
When Sebastian Driesbach finally discovered his identity and found his birth mother, it was too late. When the French left Germany, they took with them all the archives concerning the thousands of children forcibly taken to France. It was vital to stop the Germans one day investigating what had become of these children and potentially demanding their return. Sebastian's mother and uncle were never able to track him down. All that remained was the desperate hope of an improbable miracle.
I'd always said that one day a car would turn up and out would step Hans Peter. And that is exactly what happened.
When Sebastian found his German family in Waldum, he learned that his real German mother had made a new life for herself in France. But the old lady died a few days later, before Sebastian was able to meet her. He arrived just in time for her funeral.
I do have one regret, that I arrived too late. Perhaps if I'd discovered my story earlier, I could have met my mother. I think she had been through something really painful. She kept photographs of me in my German grandmother's arms until the day she died. My mother had signed a deed of abandonment, but for her to keep those photographs of me until the end shows how important it was to her.
Ça avait de l'importance pour elle.
Sebastian made a point of learning German, a gesture to try to fix the broken threads of his past.
Wenn ich 3 Jahre alt war, weil ich eine sehr gute Familie getroffen habe.
Ja, danke.
Danke.
It took more than a year for Sebastian to finally discover the identity that was stolen from him 70 years earlier. The French archives, which harbored so many secrets, are now a pathway into revealing all these individual journeys. Perhaps one day, other children of the war, whose destinies were turned upside down, may try to discover their true stories.